The execution of King Charles in January 1649 was not the final chapter in one of Britain's most tragic stories. If the people of the British Isles imagined a new era of peace and stability, they were to be sorely disappointed. England was now a commonwealth and not a kingdom, and amid the rancour and the disagreements, new policies and systems would have to emerge. This bruised and battered country was still forced to contemplate an uncertain future.
People were determined not to kill each other in large numbers, and they were worried about the impact of civil conflict on the rest of society.
Instead, what they want is to secure a civilian form of government that will be friendly towards the army and will fulfil the army's military, religious, political, constitutional ambitions and agenda.
With the king gone, Cromwell at last began to wield real political authority, and he was elected as the first chairman of the new Council of State that was first convened in February 1649.
In the aftermath of a civil war, military reputation continued to be crucial to political power. Oliver Cromwell was a figure who had emerged as a result of his military success in the First English Civil War. He had had a background in the Eastern Association, he had a background as a cavalry officer, he became commander of the cavalry in the New Model Army. For a man from the rather humbler reaches of the Huntingdonshire gentry, he was doing extremely well.
Cromwell had achieved his ambitions through the power of his personality, the force of his fiery oratory, and his undoubted military genius. He had created a unique opportunity to realize his dream of establishing the new Jerusalem in England.
Cromwell's New Jerusalem would be a place where every man could worship in his own way, as long as that worship was genuine and was not pressed on others. It did not, however, include the papists.
There's Cromwell, the conservative country gentleman, the traditionalist, the Cromwell who wants healing and settling, as he says it. He wants to end the civil wars, he wants to restore as much as possible of the traditional civilian forms of government. But against that there's Cromwell the radical, Cromwell the religious visionary, Cromwell the man of God, the Cromwell who believed that it was now payback time.
England may have been pacified, but Ireland and Scotland still played host to many royalist sympathisers and, more worryingly for Cromwell, royalist armies. He viewed these threats as more dangerous than any possible return of his English royalist enemies.
There is more cause of danger from disunion among ourselves than by anything from our enemies. But I'd rather be overrun with a Cavalierish interest than a Scotch interest. I'd rather be overrun with a Scotch interest than an Irish interest, and I think of all this is the most dangerous. Now that should awaken all Englishmen.
Effectively, the Irish Rebellion of 1641 has never really been put down. And that's why, within a few months of the trial and execution and the establishment of the Republic, Cromwell is authorised to command a large part of the New Model Army to restore English Protestant control over Ireland.
Appointed Lord General of the Parliamentary Forces in Ireland in March 1649, he set about the task of subduing the rebellious Irish forces with his usual vigour and confident expectations of victory. This phase of Cromwell's life was to bring him lasting infamy in so many parts of Ireland and the British Isles. On the 4th of September 1649, Cromwell's fearsome New Model Army made an assault on the royalist-held town of Drogheda.
From his landing place in Ireland, Drogheda represented the next logical step. The town of Drogheda and the fortress of Drogheda marked the centre of royalist resistance within Ireland, and it also blocked his road north.
Two huge assaults by Cromwell's army were thrown back before a third, led by Cromwell in person, succeeded in breaking into the town. Cromwell's own words show that he was in no mood to compromise, negotiate, or show mercy.
The enemy retreated, diverse of them, into the Mill Mount. A place very strong and of difficult access, being exceedingly high, having a good graft, and strongly palisaded. The governor, Sir Arthur Aston, and divers considerable officers being there, our men, getting up to them, were ordered by me to put them all to the sword. And indeed, being in the heat of action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town, and I think that night they put to sword about 2,000 men. These atrocities, they were done in the heat of action. But the slaughter will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are the only satisfactory grounds to such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret.
Oliver Cromwell's campaign in Ireland in 1649 has become notorious in Irish history. It's regarded as a clear sign of the cruelty of the English. It's important to put this in context. In neither Drogheda or Wexford were women or children killed, and although the garrison at Drogheda was slaughtered, about 2,500 men being killed and the few who weren't slaughtered were sent off to the West Indies, the laws of war at that stage allowed for the slaughter of people when garrisons were stormed. Furthermore, the actual nature of warfare in Ireland had been bloody throughout the 1640s, and the rebels in 1641 had slaughtered a fair number of people themselves.
But nonetheless, it remains a blot on Cromwell's military record. It is out of kilter with his usual way of operating in England and Wales, Scotland, and even in much of Ireland, and it has become notorious. It shows that Cromwell was a man of his times with strong anti-Catholic views. It shows that he was locked into, by then, a well-established and, in our eyes, sickening cycle of violence.
Shortly after the slaughter at Drogheda, the town of Wexford became the scene of a similar tragic sequence of events.
Often twinned with the massacre at Drogheda is the so-called massacre almost exactly a month later at Wexford. The circumstances are rather different. Whereas at Drogheda, Cromwell, as an act of policy, had deliberately decided to kill defenders en masse. At Wexford, he seems to have been open to a negotiated surrender, and indeed he and his officers were in the process of trying to negotiate a peaceful handover when Prematurely and before terms had been reached, some of the defenders threw down their weapons and allowed his troops in. So the English troops massed in, not under control, and huge bloodletting is unleashed there. It probably wasn't Cromwell's design from the outset as it had been at Drogheda. It also has to be said, however, that he didn't go out of his way to control his men very quickly.
Behind him, Oliver Cromwell left a lasting legacy of bitterness and hatred in Ireland that endures to this very day. Succeeding generations remember the curse of Cromwell only too well, a view firmly at odds with Cromwell's own belief that the bloodshed had been a marvellous great mercy. The job in Ireland had been done, but the victory was ultimately to prove hollow. Writing nearly 300 years later, the eminent historian C.H. Firth noted that,
In truth, Cromwell did much harm and little good in Ireland. Of Drogheda and Wexford, their memory still helps to separate the two races Cromwell wished to unite.
whatever the truth, it had been one of English history's most brutal episodes.
The brutality exerted in Ireland, the rigorous prosecution of Catholics and the enforcement of implantation of Protestant religion succeeded only in creating a two-tier system which saw the native Irish deprived of their birthright, and it only instituted a long-term and very, very deep-seated resentment of Protestantism and the English in general.
Cromwell initially seems to have envisaged having conquered Ireland, some form of a more peaceful settlement that would have brought benefits as well as costs to Ireland. But it has to be said that later on, he and other English politicians ruled Ireland with a rod of iron, and that things like the mass confiscation of Catholic property, the dispossession of large numbers of the majority population, mean that the treatment of Ireland by Cromwell, the treatment of Ireland by the English Republic, has justifiably a fairly dim reputation, certainly in Ireland and against many historians in England and Wales and Britain as a whole.
Fresh from his exploits in Catholic Ireland, Cromwell now moved to confront the Protestant Scots. Ironically, Scotland was now the sworn enemy of the parliamentary forces with whom they had united to defeat Charles in the Civil War only 3 years previously. There had been genuine outrage in Scotland at the execution of King Charles I. Having joined with Parliament to rid the country of those that advised and counselled the king, the Scots certainly had no further quarrel with the monarch himself. They had also been duped by Parliament into believing that the Scottish Presbyterian religion would be established as the official state religion in England as the price of their support in the Civil War. By 1650, the hollowness of that promise had become clear, and relations between the two sides had completely broken down.
There was never any doubt that the new English Republic would try and reconquer Ireland. It was a rebellious state over which England claimed control. Scotland, on the other hand, was a separate independent nation over which the English Republic claimed no right of sovereignty. And thus the perspective was that there was no need for it to go to war. They could be friendly allies, as they had been in the 1640s, to independent Protestant nations. But after the execution of Charles I, the Scots had decided to crown his eldest surviving son, and they decided to declare him not only King of Scotland, but also King of England, and that was a threat.
The dark clouds of war gathered once more.
Cromwell's open-handedness in achieving his stated aim of the New Jerusalem, and including the Jews, went against everything that the Presbyterians stood against. It broke the Solemn League and Covenant that even Cromwell had signed. The Scots realised that they'd probably exchanged one king for another at this point, and this was exploited by Charles II.
The young Prince Charles was brought to Scotland from the Low Countries in order to sign the covenant that confirmed his acceptance of the Presbyterian religion, and the Scots began to form the army that would invade England.
Charles II, as he was calling himself and as the Scots were calling him, had a strange attitude towards religion throughout his life. Some historians suggest that he didn't have a deep personal faith, that he could be flexible, he just wanted the maximum out of religion, the church, right through to his deathbed. At this time, he certainly seems to have had no love for Presbyterianism, for a number of reasons, but partly because under the Presbyterian system there is very little power or control for the head of state. It's a bottom-up, not a top-down system. But nonetheless, he must take the covenant and abide by Presbyterianism, otherwise the Scots will not go through with the coronation and give him military support. So having delayed as long as possible, he eventually went through and rather unhappily, unwillingly, went through the procedure of accepting Presbyterianism.
Fairfax flatly refused to go to war against his former allies. He addressed a committee of the Council of State in 1650.
I think it is doubtful whether we have a just cause to make an invasion upon Scotland. With them we are joined in the National League and Covenant. For us to enter their country and to make war upon them is that which I cannot see the justice of, nor how we shall be able to justify the lawlessness of it before God and man.
Despite Fairfax's deep reservations, Cromwell invaded Scotland, entering the country during the summer of 1650. He had planned to bring the Scots army quickly to battle, but the wily Scots commander David Leslie would not commit his troops. Eventually, the exhausted English army retired to Dunbar, only to find themselves quickly surrounded by Leslie's men. It was a golden opportunity for the Scots to destroy Cromwell's army once and for all. But impatient Scottish ministers forced Leslie's hand. On the 3rd of September, 1650, the Battle of Dunbar ended in disaster for the Scots. A soldier of Cromwell's army, writing after the Battle of Dunbar, remembered the zeal with which Cromwell went about his task.
Cromwell carried on with a divine impulse. He did laugh so excessively, as if he had been drunk, and his eyes sparkled with spirits.
At the end of the battle, more than 3,000 Scots had lost their lives, and 10,000 had been taken prisoner. During the following months, Charles, who had been crowned King Charles II of Scotland on New Year's Day 1651, took command of the Scots army himself, and, while Cromwell occupied the Scottish capital city of Edinburgh, he slipped across the border and made for the western counties of England.
When Charles II invaded England in 1651, he was in a really difficult position. The new model army was far larger, but Charles came south hoping, like Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745, that there would be a mass rallying to the Stuart cause. There wasn't.
He thought that once within England, his Scottish Royalist army would acquire much more support. English people would come out in support of him, and he believed that he could, by force, return to the throne in London and regain full power.
This lack of support meant that the Royalist army was outnumbered more than 2 to 1 at Worcester, the scene of Cromwell's last battle. His army had hastened south from Scotland to meet the threat of the invading army in a battle Cromwell called God's Crowning Mercy.
Charles Stuart found himself and his army hemmed into Worcester, And Cromwell then took his time, and on the 3rd of September he launched his troops against Charles Stuart and the Scottish Royalists, hemmed in and outnumbered in Worcester. Charles Stuart did try and give battle, but numbers, preparation, supplies, ammunition told.
It was a small army, a greatly outnumbered army. There were about 12,000 Royalists and about 30,000 in Cromwell's force.
The day ended with a complete, unmitigated, unlimited military success for Cromwell's parliamentary forces.
Once Charles had been defeated, he fled. Sensibly so. He would probably have been at the best imprisoned and maybe executed like his father had he been captured. There was a justly celebrated flight which involved heroic episodes, and these episodes are true. The story of him hiding in an oak tree is absolutely true.
With a small group of followers and in disguise, he first of all travelled around the West Midlands and then headed south to take boat to take him to the continent, having many adventures that he retold and probably elaborated years later to anyone who would listen, including on one occasion Samuel Pepys.
Charles gets away and Cromwell is able to pursue his course in England without having to worry too much about royalist threats.
Battles of a different nature now lay ahead for the man who believed himself to be a mere instrument of God's will. This time, the struggles were not military but political, and they were to prove as difficult as any Cromwell had faced on the field of battle. In 1651, with his years of military struggle behind him, Cromwell was believed to be the man who should set about the task of the Great Reformation in church and state in England. Since 1648, the country had been governed by what was known as the Rump Parliament. This group of 60 men was the remnant of the Long Parliament of 1640 that had somehow survived the various coups, plots, fighting and changes of allegiance in the intervening 11 years. The Council of State, to which Cromwell was re-elected in November 1651, was the Rump Parliament's executive. Elections for a new parliament were long overdue, but the unpopular Rump, used to unfettered power and with its own financial interests most in mind, was in no hurry to dissolve itself. The Perpetuation Act, which gave Rump members a power of veto, and which not even the most ardent royalist would have dared contemplate, further increased the government's unpopularity throughout the country and among the army. Finally, in April 1653, Cromwell lost patience. Forewarned of a parliamentary plot to relieve him of his command of the army, Cromwell prepared for the parliamentary debate on the issue by placing 30 of his trusted musketeers in the lobby of the House. As the bill was read out, Cromwell said nothing. But as the Speaker proposed that the motion be passed, Cromwell rose to his feet to speak.
I thank the members of this noble House for the great care and pains it has formerly taken with regard to the public good in the early years of its sitting. However, in recent years your love of good works hath turned to a love of injustice, delays of justice, self-interest, and other faults. Do you have a heart to do anything for public good? You have espoused the corrupt interest of presbytery and lawyers who were the supporters of tyranny and oppression. Perhaps you think this is not parliamentary language. I confess it is not. Neither are you to expect any such from me. It is not fit that you should sit as a parliament any longer. You have sat long enough, unless you had done more good. Come, come, I will put an end to your prating. You are no parliament. I say you are no parliament. I will put an end to your sitting. Call them in. Call them in.
With that, the members of the Rump Parliament were ushered from the House by Cromwell's soldiers. Cromwell picked up the mace that symbolised the Speaker's authority. Passing the mace to one of his soldiers, he said,
What shall we do with this? Here, take it away.
The Rump Parliament did not meet Cromwell's needs for a number of reasons, but also there was an air of failure about them in the early 1650s, because while Cromwell's forces had been uniting the British Isles, the Rump Parliament had become involved in a lengthy war with the leading economic power in Europe, the Dutch, the so-called First Anglo-Dutch War, and it wasn't a war that had gone brilliantly well. It was also expensive.
Cromwell believed that the Rump Parliament were rushing through a government bill that would allow for open, free, uncontrolled elections that would return a perhaps pro-royalist or at least anti-army parliament, and he didn't want that. He wanted a parliament, but it had to be a controlled parliament, and he believed that the government bill didn't give security for the future election. More generally, he expelled the Rump Parliament because he and his military colleagues had lost patience with the Rump. Instead of pressing ahead with godly reformation and the sort of religious, political, constitutional programme that Cromwell and the army wanted and that they believed God wanted, the Rump had dragged its feet and achieved very little. It's another example of how from time to time Cromwell and the army intervened directly in essentially civilian government, removing one form of government that wasn't achieving their ends, or they would say God's ends, but then in April 1653, as earlier, not being willing to take command and control themselves, instead, after scratching their heads for a few weeks, coming up with another ostensibly civilian form of government that perhaps would do the army's and God's wills.
Little more than a decade earlier, King Charles had tried similar tactics to impose his will on Parliament and had failed miserably. This time, the House bowed to the will of Oliver Cromwell with barely a whimper. Despite his dissolution of the Rump Parliament, Cromwell seemed to have no intention of governing alone. As quickly as possible, an interim Parliament of Puritan representatives, known as the Barebone Parliament, was nominated, and this began sitting in July 1653.
The nominated assembly, the little parliament, the Parliament of Saints, the Barebones Parliament, whatever we call it, from July to December 1653, was another of these army experiments, a non-elected parliament appointed by the Council of Officers to do the army's will. It was to sit for perhaps 2 years, maybe give way to another shorter-lived nominated assembly, and then his view was that at some time, perhaps in the mid-1650s, the people would see the achievements of the nominated assembly and England would be in such a state that they could return to normal parliamentary elections, a normal elected parliament.
It is, like many of the bodies created, many of the groupings created in the English Civil War, prone to quarrelling with itself, which is not surprising because there were many issues of political order, of religious settlement, which were indeed very difficult issues.
The nominated assembly proved itself to be horribly divided between radicals and conservatives. The solid achievements, few and far between, Cromwell and the other army officers became increasingly worried and disillusioned about where the nominated assembly was going, and probably connived at, encouraged, induced the resignation of the nominated assembly in December 1653.
Cromwell was now back in the same lonely position he had been when he dissolved the Rump Parliament. He said,
My power was again by this resignation as boundless and unlimited as before, all things being subject to arbitrariness, and myself a person having power over the 3 nations without bound or limit set. It is a story of my own weakness and folly, and yet it was done in my simplicity. I had thought that men of our own judgment, who had fought in the wars, would work with me in harmony. but it was not to be.
With only the other army generals alongside him, Cromwell reluctantly accepted the written constitution known as the Instrument of Government. He flatly refused, however, to become king, taking only the title Lord Protector.
Parliament offers Cromwell the crown. They wanted to become king as part of a new, slightly revised written constitution. But eventually, having agonised for several weeks, he rejects it firmly. Parliament accept that. The slightly revised constitution is accepted with him continuing as Lord Protector, not king.
Although some of his supporters were willing to, support him to be monarch, there was just not enough support across the whole political spectrum. In particular, a number of the generals were genuinely unhappy with the idea of a revival of monarchy.
Another answer would be that Cromwell was fearful that taking the crown would be a sign of personal ambition. It would increase accusations that were already circulating that he didn't want godly reformation or other ends, he just wanted his own glorification.
But I also think Cromwell's position itself is important. He didn't see himself as monarch, and in some respects, a monarch was a secular figure which was an infringement on his view of the kind of God-given authority that ought to prevail.
He might also have feared that in taking the crown he would be pushed too far in a conservative direction, that the ideal of radical godly reformation would be reduced, would be put back. He would be weaned away from it by the conservative politicians.
Cromwell's honourable intentions were also made clear when he swore an oath accepting the new constitution. New elections to Parliament were to be held in 1654, but until then, Cromwell would rule alone.
I do promise in the presence of God that I will not violate or infringe the matters and things contained therein, but to my power observe the same and cause them to be observed, and shall in all other things, to the best of my understanding, govern these nations according to the laws, statutes, and customs thereof, seeking their peace, and causing justice and law to be equally administered.
The Protectorate was probably the most durable and one of the most long-lasting of these constitutional experiments of the interregnum 49 to 60. It lasts from December 1653 through until the spring of 1659, so it lasts a bit over 5 years. It's also the first and last time in our history when we've had a written constitution, and the constitution was very clear in setting out a division of powers. Although there was to be a single head of state called a Lord Protector, that head of state was to share his powers with others. There were to be elected parliaments from time to time, and there was also a permanent executive council with whom he would have to work. And we know it's an interesting feature of Cromwell's character and personality. He was very worried by political power. He was very fearful that it would corrupt him. And so Cromwell, I believe, went out of his way to work in accordance with this constitution, and that although as head of state he had considerable powers, he did, I believe, in practice operate government as head of state in coordination with council or parliament during the time of his protectorate.
Despite Cromwell's emotional commitment to Parliament, the seductive allure of the unrestricted power left its mark on Cromwell, and he was never again able to work with a Parliament. Although the elections had been held as promised, in 1655 he personally dissolved the troublesome group who had been elected as the first Parliament of the Protectorate. Cromwell had been simply unable to agree with them on key religious and constitutional issues. So it was that the Lord Protector once more ruled alone. Only this time it was by his own design. It is one of history's great ironies that Cromwell's rule over England was more tyrannical and extreme in nature than that of any royalist. Taxes were raised to pay for the army and the navy. Extremist groups such as the Levellers were put down. Troublesome judges were summarily dismissed. In 1655, it was decided that the country should be divided into 11 districts, with a major general in each responsible for law and order. This period of rule by Cromwell and his major generals was joyless and unhappy. These were dark, dour days in England, days made worse by Cromwell's controversial foreign policy.
Having brought peace to Britain, Cromwell, of course, embarked on war abroad. The big war was war with Spain, and Britain was at war with Spain from 1655 until the end of the decade.
It brought new possessions in the West Indies, including the island of Jamaica. It brought for a time a territorial possession on the continent, the town of Dunkirk. In military terms, it was successful and fruitful. The problem was that it was also very expensive.
The cost of developing an enormous navy, the cost of sending a large army to the continent, was one that destabilised the finances of the Cromwellian regime and in a sense destabilised the regime as a whole. The financial demands placed by the regime on the public became too great, the regime became unpopular.
In the summer of 1656, Cromwell was forced to recall Parliament in order to pay for the Spanish War. It was, of course, the supreme irony. In 1640, King Charles' desperate need to pay for the wars with the Scots had forced him to call the Long Parliament. That Parliament had become the King's judge and executioner. Cromwell had been a member, and now a Parliament summoned by him was about to cause another major constitutional crisis. There was, however, a promising start. Although the new Parliament urged the office of King on Cromwell, and once again he refused, he accepted a new constitution that allowed him to appoint his own successor, and that established an upper chamber in Parliament, effectively a House of Lords. The wheel had now come full circle. In all but name, Cromwell had become the king that he had helped to remove with so much bloodshed. Like Charles, he also quarrelled constantly with his parliaments, disagreeing vehemently with them on key issues, until, in 1658, he angrily dissolved the second Parliament of the Protectorate, telling them, "God will judge between you and me." The Lord Protector continued his rule with an iron fist, putting down civilian plots and exerting his will over the army. Yet Cromwell was approaching the age of 60, and gradually this energetic man of action began to weary and tire. His health, once so robust, began to give way. In August 1658, there came a deep personal tragedy, when Cromwell's favourite daughter Elizabeth became ill and died. The devoted father and loving family man never recovered from the shock or overcame his grief. After nominating his son Richard to succeed him, the Lord Protector himself fell ill. Completely worn out in body and spirit, his condition worsened until he slipped into a coma. On the 3rd of September 1658, on the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell breathed his last. After his death, Cromwell's much hoped-for constitutional and religious settlements were never to be achieved. In the uncertain hands of his son Richard, his protectorate survived for only 20 more months.
Richard was a country gentleman in Hampshire. He was too young to have played any significant role in the Civil War. Oliver himself was a little bit worried about his son's character. He viewed him as a bit of a wastrel. He'd run up debts. He hadn't studied as hard as Cromwell would have liked. He wasn't as godly as Cromwell would have liked. He wasn't particularly skilled. He wasn't an experienced or adroit politician and statesman. And above all, he had no real military background. The army and the army officers and the new model army put up with Cromwell as head of state. They may not always have liked everything he did. They thought that at times godly reformation wasn't going forward as far and as fast as Cromwell or as they wanted, but Cromwell was always able to retain their confidence. Remember, we fought together, you can trust me, we'll live and die together. The old comradeship produced a bond of trust that just wasn't there between the army and Richard Cromwell. They dubbed him Queen Dick. They very soon lost confidence in him, and effectively in a coup d'etat, they got rid of him.
It was left to General Monk, the commander of the army in Scotland, to march south to persuade the Long Parliament to dissolve itself. There was no resistance from the new model army. They, too, were worn out with fighting, and they sensed the mood of the country for a peaceful settlement. A new Parliament was elected, and their first act was to invite Prince Charles back from the Low Countries to rule as Charles II. Charles had already stated his willingness to settle all grievances with Parliament in the Declaration of Breda. On the 25th of May, 1660, a tall, dark, 30-year-old man landed at Dover. He made his way through Kent and, travelling on to London, entered the city to the cheers of a joyful population. Charles II had returned as king, and the monarchy had been restored.
It would have been surprising to contemporaries to be told that Charles II would become king in England within 2 years. But Cromwell left a legacy of poor relations between political groupings that were loyal to the regime, as well as a widespread disaffection with the regime itself.
After Oliver's death, no one could repeat the trick of holding the army in check with a civilian regime. Thereafter, there's increasing chaos and anarchy. A large number of power brokers in England, military, political, some of them former royalists, some of them former parliamentarians, come to see that only the restoration of a traditional monarchy can afford England and Britain as a whole the chance of a durable settlement and a new start. And that's why they look to Charles Stuart.
Charles II was very, very different to his father. Psychologically, he was different. He was a much more amenable character and was not hung up on his father's high sense of moral commitment. But also, he had learnt an enormous amount. He had learnt from the experience of failure. Already, as a young man, he had shown himself willing, after the death of his father, to go to Scotland, to accept a Presbyterian church settlement, and to use that as a basis for invading England in 1651. Therefore, to come in 1660 in a settlement which was what was offered him, the so-called Restoration Settlement, did not appear to him too terrible a fate.
Cromwell was a military genius whose political skills never matched his abilities on the battlefield. In peacetime, his rule brought little but more confusion and anarchy. While this simple analysis might be true in the short term, Cromwell left a political legacy. For the restoration of the Stuart dynasty was to prove merely an interlude, and the glorious revolution of 1688 restored many of the values of the Protectorate. Thanks in part to Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution, by the year 1688, Britain was poised on the verge of greatness.
Cromwell's Protectorate laid the basis for strands that emerged and re-emerged a bit later in English and British history, such as an expansionist, successful foreign policy, such as broad toleration for Protestants, broad liberty of conscience for Protestant groups. Those sort of features re-emerged and perhaps owe their origins to the work of Cromwell as Lord Protector. The English Revolution of the mid-17th century was in some ways a temporary, incomplete, reversed revolution. It was the second, much briefer and ostensibly less revolutionary revolution, the Glorious Revolution, that brought to fruition many of the earlier seeds that Cromwell and his colleagues had sown and significantly changed the course of English and British history.
So, for all its troubles and problems, it seems the Commonwealth and Protectorate had achieved greatness. Its chief architect, Oliver Cromwell, the common man who emerged as a military and political giant, left behind a legacy far beyond the permanence of parliamentary rule in Britain. However, the bitter civil war had deeply scarred the soul of the nation.
The English Civil War was in many senses the most traumatic set of events in English history. It led to a total overthrow of the political system, culminating in the execution of the King, the destruction of the House of Lords, the purging successively of the House of Commons. It led to a religious overthrow, an overthrow of the Church of England, and it led in part to social radicalisation. It led to groups in society who were not from the highest orders, who were not aristocrats, who were not gentry, seizing power. And it was always, as it were, a warning against monarchy or any government pushing matters too far.